Hello out there. Welcome to week 13 of Arts 1001. This week we will work on connecting and synthesizing the wealth of information that we've covered this term. As always, our 4 key course questions will be our guides. This first lecture will survey the Western thought conversation as it has developed in this course, beginning in ancient Mesopotamia and arriving at Renaissance Europe. I'll focus today on texts, topics, and thinkers from this long historical period, and we will stay within the traditional Western canon. My second lecture this week will be devoted to how we can question and problematize Western thought and its canonical texts. And that is when we will revisit the contemporary indigenous perspectives we have encountered this term as well. This lecture will work through the first 3 of our key course questions. What is knowledge? What is human happiness? And how do we live together? We'll begin with the question of knowledge. So this is a huge question, and we're going to approach it through a series of related questions. How do we know what we know? What are the sources of our knowledge, and are some more valid than others? Do we as human beings decide what is true, good, and just? Or are there absolute and timeless truths beyond us? If there are absolutes, how can we come to know them? Can we come to know them? And finally, what are our responsibilities as people with knowledge? To begin with, there is a strong sense in the ancient cultures we studied and in all 3 of the Abrahamic faiths that foundational knowledge for human life can come from stories, traditions, and ceremonies. For ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians, creation myths contained important truths about the relationship between the gods, humanity, and the cosmos, and reciting these myths in annual ceremonies was a way for humans to participate in the renewal of the cosmic order. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, epics like Homer's Odyssey and poetry like that written by Sappho were treasuries of wisdom on how to live a good life. These poems were performed at banquets and festivals and written down over and over again over hundreds of years because of the high esteem in which they were held. And of course, for all the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim authors we've read this term, the stories of the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran are absolutely fundamental sources of knowledge. Stories play a crucial role in indigenous knowledge as well, as we'll discuss in detail in my next lecture. In addition to stories, a number of our texts this term have discussed other important sources of knowledge. In the allegory of the cave in the Republic, Plato condemns sense perception as deceptive. He suggests that the objects of sense perception are like untrustworthy shadows, about which people can form opinions but never hold true knowledge. Following closely after Plato, Aristotle took a more balanced approach, arguing that reliable knowledge can be obtained through sense perception and through reason. For Aristotle, we arrive at the knowledge of forms by reasoning about the many material examples of something that we encounter in the world of sense perception. Plato and Aristotle may have disagreed on the role of the senses in establishing true knowledge, but they agree with one another and the other thinkers we've discussed this term that there are indeed absolute truths that exist independently of human thought and will, and which are the ultimate goal of human knowledge. This is a given for all Jewish, Christian, and Muslim texts, since the Abrahamic God regularly hands down divine laws and reveals absolute truths through scripture and chosen prophets. But we also find the belief in divine laws and absolute truths in texts from polytheistic pagan contexts. In Sophocles' Antigone, Antigone insists that the laws of the gods require her to bury her brother. In Plato's allegory of the cave, the true objects of knowledge are immaterial, eternal, unchanging forms, which exist independently of the human intellect and can only be known through reason. The highest forms are absolutes like justice itself, beauty itself, and of course, the good itself. Aristotle adopts Plato's idea of absolute good, or the good itself, in the form of the unmoved mover, which he also calls self-thinking thought, fully actualized big B being, which moves everything else in the cosmos by being loved. Within the many thinkers who endorse absolutes, there is an important division between those who think we can know the good or God on our own, and those who insist that we need divine illumination or revelation. The Greek philosopher Aristotle and the Muslim theologian Ibn Rushd affirm that human reason can attain knowledge of absolute truth by its own operation. And it's no surprise that they're in agreement, since Ibn Rushd studied Aristotle closely. The Renaissance humanist Pico della Mirandola goes even further. Not only does he claim that philosophers can understand everything through their reason, he claims that doing so makes them heavenly beings, and that it is possible to lift oneself even higher and become like God. Other thinkers we've studied this term take a more pessimistic view, insisting that human reason can only obtain full knowledge of absolute truth through divine illumination or revelation. In the allegory of the cave, the first prisoner to escape must be mysteriously loosed from his chains and forcefully compelled to climb the difficult path up into the sunlight, where his vision is eventually illuminated by the sight of the sun itself, which symbolizes the good itself. In medieval Christian theology, this illumination becomes the gift of divine revelation. Augustine and Aquinas both rely on and praise Greek philosophy for helping them understand other truths, like the relationship between God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit in the Trinity, the nature of evil, and the existence of God. So human reason can attain knowledge of some absolute truths, but not all of them. Only revelation, in the form of the scriptures, allows the human mind to grasp the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ. For their part, mystics of all three Abrahamic religions speak of attaining ecstatic union with God, an experience that is beyond what human reason can understand and human speech can describe. In her dialogue, Catherine of Siena is clear that her experience of mystical union with God also does not arise from her own capacities. It is a kind of illumination, an unspeakably dazzling brightness, and very much a gift of grace from God. However knowledge is achieved, through stories, experience, reason, or revelation, there is general agreement among the thinkers we considered this term that people with knowledge have an obligation to benefit their communities. I don't want to belabor this point by going over every reading and thinker, so here are some of the standout examples. The Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh is fundamentally about Gilgamesh's education in how to be a good king and a human being. His quest for immortality teaches him the crucial lesson that death is inescapable. This does not drive him to continue roaming the wilderness in despair. Instead, he returns to Uruk and devotes himself to strengthening his city. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey follow similar patterns. The heroes Achilles and Odysseus are separated from their communities and almost from the general community of humankind. Their experiences teach them something about what it means to be human and a leader, and they ultimately return to their communities, albeit with significant violence along the way. In their own ways, the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle also emphasize that those with knowledge have an obligation to their communities. This is obvious in the Republic, when Plato has Socrates lay out the concept of the philosopher kings, who have escaped the allegorical cave and could simply spend their days contemplating the forms, but must return into the darkness and become leaders, because they and only they have the true wisdom needed to rule well. Aristotle does not follow Plato in arguing that the state can only be ruled wisely by philosopher kings. In fact, in the section of the Politics that we read, he even suggests that all citizens working together might just make better decisions than if experts ruled over them. But knowledge is still crucial. Aristotle imagines each citizen contributing his share of practical wisdom to the common cause to create a citizen body with considerable intelligence. For Aristotle, however much wisdom a person may have, it is owed to and enhances the intelligence of the sovereign citizen body as a whole. The Renaissance humanists likewise stressed the importance of practical wisdom and political activity. They reoriented the educational system they had inherited from the Middle Ages so that students would acquire the skills and knowledge they needed to serve their states, through the study of subjects like rhetoric, history, and practical moral philosophy. The humanist ideal of the educated person embracing a life in politics is borne out in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, if we take a positive view of the character of Prospero. Before the action of the play commences, Prospero has lost his duchy of Milan because he neglected his political obligations in order to devote himself to study. But over the course of the play, he uses his magic to put things right and regain his dukedom. Henceforth, it is implied, he will be an active and attentive ruler, using all of his wisdom and skills to rule wisely and well. Let's turn now to our second key question: what is human happiness? To answer this, we need to think about several related questions. First, what makes a human, and what, if anything, separates us from animals, gods, and monsters? And second, what does it mean to live a good and happy life? Almost all our readings agree that happiness is living to one's fullest potential as a human being, but that allows for considerable variation as different thinkers define the human in different ways. Before we look at these various formulations of human happiness, we should point out that a few of our texts explored the line between human and monster and suggested that humans can be or become monstrous. This is a theme that you will pick up on in Arts 1002 when you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We met two so-called monsters this term: the Cyclops Polyphemus in Homer's Odyssey and Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest. Polyphemus is fairly obviously a monster, at least as Odysseus describes him. He is far bigger and stronger than a human being. He seems to have only one immense eye in the middle of his forehead, and he mercilessly kills and devours Odysseus's companions. On the other hand, Polyphemus is an attentive and affectionate shepherd of his flock, and Odysseus is an uninvited intruder who shows up, eats Polyphemus's cheese, demands gifts from him, and eventually devises a scheme to trick Polyphemus and blind him. So which of them is truly the monster? And does Polyphemus only become monstrous in response to Odysseus? These questions surface again in The Tempest when we consider the character of Caliban. As Dr. Smith discussed in her guest lecture, the descriptions of Caliban throughout the play are slippery and indefinite. Some other characters seem to see him as a human-animal hybrid. Others refer to him as a man, but an ugly one. His behavior in the play is hardly upright and virtuous. He does plot an assassination attempt, but the Italian noblemen who have washed up on his island hardly conduct themselves any better. Caliban also protests that he has been dispossessed of the island by Prospero, who now forces him to labor in his service under constant threat of physical punishment. So, is Caliban a monster? Has he been made monstrous by his treatment at Prospero's hands? Are the other characters monstrous in the ways that they behave? Caliban's presence in the play does not definitively answer these questions, but it certainly asks us to reflect upon how a person might become a monster. We'll turn now to definitions of human happiness that are more concerned with distinguishing what makes a human a human. In the earliest cultures and texts that we discussed, there is a strong sense that, unlike the gods, human beings are mortal creatures made for suffering. Therefore, happiness is embracing the pleasures of this world and enduring life's sorrows. We saw this idea expressed in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the poetry of Sappho, which beautifully celebrates the fleeting joys of pleasure in the face of loss. As we move forward in time into classical Athens and the age of philosophy, a new way of thinking about humanity emerges. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all argue that, unlike animals, human beings are rational creatures capable of virtue. Happiness is therefore living virtuously in accordance with reason. This idea is picked up by some Christian, Jewish, and Muslim thinkers, but those traditions also depart from the pagan thinkers of Greece and Rome in regarding humanity as God's special creation. This idea is present in the sacred books of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and is clear from many of the texts we read this term, which suggest that happiness is a right relationship with God. This is one of the fundamental messages of the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran, and it is reflected in the autobiographical texts of the Christian saints Perpetua, Augustine, and Catherine of Siena. At the same time, especially within Christianity, there is another important strand of thinking about humanity that sees human beings as creatures stained with original sin, the sin that Adam and Eve committed when they disobeyed God's commands and ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's important to note that this view of humanity does not seem to arise in Judaism or Islam. In those faiths, humanity's relationship with God is restored by God's new covenants with Noah and Abraham, and it is possible for human beings to choose to follow God's commandments and thereby live good and happy lives. Many Christians, however, believe that human will and human intellect are defective and broken because of original sin, and for them, happiness can only come through receiving God's grace, which a human being cannot earn and never truly deserves. This term, we saw this belief at work in medieval Christian texts like Augustine's Confessions and Catherine of Siena's Dialogue. It will resurface with a vengeance when you meet the Protestant reformers of Arts 1002. In this term, however, we found that the Renaissance ushered in a whole new way of approaching humanity known as humanism, and it was given its most extreme expression in Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man. In this remarkable text, Pico argues that human beings do not have a definite nature, and that is what makes us the most excellent of God's creations. We have limitless potential, and we can choose to live as plants, animals, heavenly beings, or perhaps even gods, the ultimate happiness. This Renaissance optimism about human nature speaks out again, in less over-the-top form, in Christine de Pizan's Book of the City of Ladies, which argues that human beings are excellent and noble creatures made in the image of God. And furthermore, both men and women can choose to live good and happy lives. Prospero's daughter Miranda memorably encapsulates this view of human nature when she exclaims, in the final scene of The Tempest, "How many goodly creatures are there here! How beauteous mankind is! O brave new world that has such people in it!" On the other hand, The Tempest is actually full of conniving, manipulative, power-hungry noblemen, and we shouldn't forget that the Renaissance also gives us Machiavelli, who takes an altogether pessimistic view of human nature. Learning from experience and the study of history that human beings are wicked, self-interested wretches, Machiavelli concludes that human happiness does not lie in the fulfillment of human potential or the full flourishing of a life of virtue. For him, happiness is more simply security, a life lived in safety in an orderly, peaceful state. This brings us to the third and final question we will consider in this lecture. How do we live together? We've explored this question throughout the term by thinking about three related sub-questions. Why do people organize themselves into communities and political systems? Who should hold power in society and on what grounds? And what do we as individuals owe to the societies in which we live? I want to begin with a quote from Aristotle's Politics, which provides crucial insight into the why of human political communities. Aristotle writes, "We may say that while a state comes into existence for the sake of mere life, it exists for the sake of a good life." With this in mind, let's look at some of the main political systems we've discussed this term and how each claims to support the good life in some way. We'll begin with various forms of one-person rule, then look at democracy, and finish up with mixed constitutions or republics. The first system of government that we considered was monarchy with divine sanction, and the examples we looked at include ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Israel, as well as the later Roman Empire and the medieval caliphs and kings. The fundamental premise of monarchy with divine sanction is that the monarch should hold power because their authority comes from the gods or from the capital G God of the Abrahamic faith. Those who believe in monarchy with divine sanction would tell you that it fosters human happiness because human laws are in harmony with divine law. Closely related in some ways to monarchy with divine sanction is Plato's concept of the philosopher king, which we read about in the Republic. In the Republic, Plato argues that philosophers should rule because they have true knowledge, and crucially, because they alone don't want to rule, and so they won't exploit the position for their own gain. Plato also tells us that a state ruled by a philosopher king would foster human happiness because governance is in harmony with justice. So much as the monarchs with divine sanction have access to direct knowledge of divine law or the good, so too the philosopher king deserves to rule and can foster human happiness because they have direct access to knowledge of what justice truly is. Of course, the reality of one-person rule can be very different from what is idealized in Plato's Republic. And so our final example of this type of government is autocracy. The examples of autocracy that we looked at include the early Roman Empire and the Duchy of Milan. Rather than claiming divine sanction or absolute knowledge, an autocrat holds power through personal abilities and particularly the ability to control the means of violence in a state. Autocrats don't necessarily claim that their goal is to foster human happiness, but nonetheless, we did have one text we discussed which argued that autocracy can in fact be a good form of government which does foster human happiness, and that's Machiavelli's The Prince, which claims that an autocrat, even an autocrat who rules brutally and keeps his people in a state of fear, can bring about, at the very least, peace and stability, which are better than the alternatives of warfare and bloodshed. On the opposite end of the political spectrum from autocracy, we had democracy, and we looked at the very important example of classical Athens. Democrats argue that citizens should hold power in the state because they are the state. And they also argue that a democracy is best suited to foster human happiness because it allows citizens to exercise their capacity of judgment and therefore to fulfill their potential as human beings. In Aristotle's Politics, we also read the idea that a democracy can benefit from the sum total of all citizens' virtues and knowledge, and in this way, surprisingly, government by the many might be better than government by a single wise individual. The final form of government that we looked at in the Western canon this term is the Republic, or a mixed constitution, and our examples there were the Roman Republic and the Renaissance Italian republics. Republicans believe that power should be carefully distributed between a monarchical element, an aristocratic element, and a democratic element. And republics are held to foster human happiness by providing just enough liberty to keep everybody happy, but balancing that liberty with the stability that comes from the monarchical and aristocratic elements. That's all for this quickie review of our 3 course questions and the answers that we've seen to them in the Western canon. Here are your next steps for the week. You'll watch a second lecture on talking back to Western thought and taking back from Western thought. Then, if you haven't already, you'll move on to your reading, which is Robin Wall Kimmerer's chapter Sky Woman Falling. After you've done the reading, you'll be ready for tutorial, and then at some point between now and when you want to start the take-home exam, you should watch the skill building video entitled Test Yourself, and there is an associated exam prep assignment, which is a flashcard worksheet. Bye for now.